They talk about the Cobras. They talk about the GT40. But what they don't talk about is the V8 that started it all. Before Carroll Shelby became a legend, before he humiliated Ferrari at Le Mans, there was one engine. One brutal, high-revving American V8 that changed everything. It wasn't just powerful, it was personal. This was the engine that made Shelby a legend and made Detroit nervous. Backstory. What made this V8 so special? You see, this was not your typical American muscle engine, since Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were the only three companies that made cars in the United States in the late 1950s and early 1960s. These companies were the ones who decided how power, technology, and new ideas would flow. Carroll Shelby, a Texan with an ambition and a stubborn streak, wasn't going to allow the big companies tell him what to do. Shelby was a very good racing driver. In 1959, he won 24 hours of Le Mans with Aston Martin. He had to leave the cockpit because of health problems, but that didn't stop him from wanting to be a pilot. That event only made him want to construct the fastest car, even though he couldn't drive it anymore. There was a chance to drive a light British sports automobile called the AC Ace. It was pretty and quick, but it really needed more power. Shelby recognized the promise. He realized that all it needed was an American heart that was loud, raw, and nasty. That heart would be from a V8. The question was, which V8? Shelby originally went to Chevrolet and asked for their small block V8s. GM didn't want to help a competition who could take on their Corvette, so they said no right away. This is where the story of Shelby and Ford begins. Ford had recently released a brand new small block V8 engine with a displacement of 221 cubic inches. A 260 cubic inch version was already ready for sale. This small block Ford V8 was small, light, and flexible. Unlike the big, heavy engines of the past, it fit Shelby's vision well. Ford, wanting to take on Chevrolet's Corvette domination, agreed to provide engines. Shelby put the 260 V8 engine in the AC Ace's engine bay, and the result was nothing short of electric. Shelby named the car the Cobra, and it would change the way American performance cars were made forever. The narrative went on. Ford quickly put in a 289 cubic inch engine instead. The more displacement there was, the more power there was. The chassis weighed little over 2,000 pounds and had over 300 horsepower. It was a formula for pandemonium on the track and fear for anyone who dared to race it on the street. The Cobra 289 became very popular. People who were privateers, racers, and fans all wanted one. It was a game changer to mix light European design with tough American muscle. It didn't just go swiftly, it couldn't be stopped. Detroit started to grow worried at that point. The truth was that Detroit wasn't worried because the Cobra constituted a business threat. The quantity of automobiles made was rather little compared to the amount of muscle cars coming out of Michigan manufacturers. What really scared them was what the Cobra stood for. This little business rented a workshop and used a British chassis and a Ford engine to humiliate factory teams on the track. If Shelby could accomplish it, why couldn't the billion-dollar firms in Detroit rule the racing world? The Cobra 289 rapidly became a popular sports vehicle in races in the US and Europe. It won a lot, but Shelby never stopped. He understood he needed more power as the competition got tougher. At that point, the 427 Cobra was born. The 427 V8 was a huge engine. Originally, it was made for NASCAR and had a 7.0-liter displacement. The block was huge, The torque was crazy, and the sound was unlike anything else on the road. Shelby's engineers had to entirely rework the chassis to make it fit. They made the frame wider and strengthened the suspension. The end product was a wild beast that made more than 425 horsepower on the street and more than 500 in race trim. The Cobra 427 became a very tough opponent on the racetrack. It was scary because it went so fast it was hard to control, and it was big. Those who learned how to handle it well won races, but those who didn't take it seriously often spun off the course. People said the automobile was one of the most deadly machines of its time since it was so quick. The Cobra was at its most popular in the middle of the 1960s, especially when Shelby and Ford worked together on a much bigger project. Ford wanted to defeat Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which appeared impossible at the time. No American firm had been able to beat Enzo Ferrari's cars in endurance racing, but Ford was determined. So they asked Carroll Shelby to make it happen. Shelby used his knowledge of the Cobra program and his skill to get the most out of the Ford V8s. He worked with a group of engineers to turn the Ford GT40 into a car that might win the Le Mans race. The GT40 finished first, second, and third at Le Mans in 1966, ending Ferrari's long run of success and putting American engineering at the top of the world of motorsport. Ford didn't just win, they won. It showed that Carroll Shelby's idea of combining minimal weight with powerful V8 engines was the key to success. Shelby had proven that the formula worked at every level of competition, from the Cobra 289 to the huge 427. Detroit had to pay attention to him now. The Big Three liked to think of themselves as the leaders in innovation. But it was Shelby, a former chicken farmer turned driver, who changed the face of international motorsport. His Cobras made the industry think about what was possible, and his alliance with Ford led to one of the biggest wins in racing history. But Shelby's V8-powered revolution didn't just happen on the track. It started to change what American performance cars were all about. The Cobra's success led to a lot of other muscle and sports vehicles coming out in the late 1960s. It became common in Detroit to think that sheer V8 power and aggressive styling could capture both speed and imagination. By that time, Carroll Shelby's story had become a legend. He not only made one of the most famous sports cars in history, but he also showed that dedication, ingenuity, and the appropriate V8 could shake up the biggest automobile companies in the world. Was the V8 Shelby's best weapon? Or was it a sign of something broader developing in American performance culture? Carroll Shelby became well known for two things: his daring ideas and his constant usage of Ford's small block and big block V8s. But his fame wasn't solely based on putting engines in cars. It was about changing how performance automobiles are made, sold, and raced. The Cobra had already taken on the world by the end of the 1960s. The 289 version showed that power and grace could operate together, and the 427 variant showed that pure strength could scare even the toughest racers. But Shelby wasn't done yet. He wanted to bring the V8 revolution to the streets in a way that regular car fans could enjoy. Ford urged him to turn the Mustang, a sporty coupe that had just come out in 1964, into a real performance car. That was the moment. Shelby saw right away that the Mustang could be great. It was stylish, cheap, and popular, but it didn't have the heart of a real racer. He realized that with the correct V8 and some Shelby touches, it might become a lot more scary. The Shelby GT350 came out in 1965 as a result. Ford's 289 cubic inch V8 was tuned to make more than 300 horsepower. It also had better suspension, brakes, and a more aggressive look. The GT350 was made in higher numbers than the Cobra, so more people could buy it. It was a street car with the DNA of a race car, and it paved the way for the time when American pony cars became real performance icons. The GT350 was not the end for Shelby. Not long after, the GT500 came out with the Ford V8 engine, which had a capacity of 428 cubic inches. It had even more power and torque, and it was the definition of muscle wrapped in Mustang skin. These cars were rough, loud, and didn't care what anyone thought. They were made to win stoplight drag races, scare other drivers on the street, and seem tough while doing it. The Shelby Mustangs showed that the same formula that worked for the Cobra could work for the general public. Detroit really started to feel the heat at this point. Shelby was no longer just a privateer working on his own. He was making Ford look good to the public, and his products were selling better and doing better than many of their competitors. Shelby's impact on racing was also rising around the world at the same time. The GT40s kept winning after their famous wins at Le Mans in 1966 and 1967, winning 4 in a row from 1966 to 1969. Shelby's fingerprints were all over these wins, and there was no doubt that he was the one who made American V8s the best in endurance racing. The accomplishment made things complicated for Detroit. They needed Shelby on one hand. He was very valued because of his reputation, ingenuity, and ability to win races. On the other hand, he was dangerous since he was independent and successful outside of their direct supervision. He had shown that little businesses could beat big ones with the appropriate engine, and that didn't sit well with corporate pride. Shelby and Ford worked together until the late 1960s and early 1970s. But things were starting to change. The golden age of big displacement engines started to come to an end because of government rules, emission laws, and soaring insurance costs. The Cobra and the GT500 were cars that showed how powerful cars could be, but the future was unclear. But Shelby had already made his mark on history. The V8s that bore his name and vision were more than just pieces of machinery. They were emblems of culture. Young fans put up posters of Cobras and Shelby Mustangs on the walls of their bedrooms. Drivers wanted to drive them. Hollywood even took note and put Shelby cars in movies and TV shows. The Shelby era of vicious V8s had already become a legend by the time the 1970s brought fuel shortages and layoffs. But the effect stayed. Shelby developed a formula that all muscle cars that came after, from Camaros to Challengers, had to follow. Detroit used to be afraid of Shelby's independence, but now they admire it. Ford brought back the Shelby Mustang brand decades later, long after the Cobra had stopped making cars, since the name still meant a lot. A Shelby emblem still symbolizes speed, power, and a direct link to the V8s that made his business successful. Looking back, Shelby's V8s weren't simply about how much power they had or how many races they won. It's about a man who wouldn't let anything stop him. He went to Ford when GM said no. When AC gave him a chassis, he gave it a new life. He was the one who brought Ferrari down when they were the best at endurance racing. At every point, the V8 was his weapon of choice. It was simple to understand, but had a terrible effect. The end. The Cobra and the Shelby Mustangs will always be remembered, not because they were perfect, but because they had a certain attitude. They were noisy, rude, and confrontational, which was typical of Shelby's personality and American car culture in the 1960s. Collectors and fans still look for original Cobras and early GT350s decades later, as if they were sacred objects. Carroll, the V8 that made Shelby famous, is an important part of his legacy. The engines were more than simply tools. They were the building blocks of an empire that made the man famous and made Detroit reassess what it could do. The small block 289, the huge 427, and the loud 428 started a revolution. If you want to see more tales like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Keep the engine screaming till we meet again. And remember that legends are made one turn at a time. See you soon.